Mr. Manuel, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning to you and all the listeners.
Um, this is, of course, this B20, G20 is an important moment for South Africa. And I know you've said that fragmentation has no place in the global order. How do you push for global cooperation with so much resistance from the United States? Can we do that?
We have to soldier on and soldier through. Um, we can't give up on this thing because part of the challenge, Clement, is that we haven't seen rationality come out of the US.
Mm.
Um, there was a bit of uh, playing on who would come, and this has been going on all year um, because the US is the newest part of a troika that South Africa makes up with Brazil. So it's the former chair, the current chair, and the incoming chair. The troika is actually the agency that runs the G20. So the US was in, and then not in, and then out again, and so on. But about mid-year, it seemed as though they'd come round and were participating more fully. And about that time, President Trump said that he wouldn't come, but Vice President J.D. Vance would attend. And there'd been so many meetings that involved very senior officials. In fact, in October, at the time of the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF, Deputy Minister Dr. David Masondo handed the report of the finance track to the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. He received that report and said, it's a wonderful report. He's read it. He looks forward to participating in the G20 in South Africa and beyond.
Mm. Mm.
And then more recently, President Trump pulled back on every bit of participation. Now, I don't think it's possible to make decisions on this basis because the very essence of an institution like the G20, which doesn't have a large secretariat and so on,
Yeah.
there is a very strong basis of trust. And that trust is represented by the Troika and the ability of the Troika to convene the other members and to deal with issues. And sometimes they're difficult issues that have to be dealt with.
Mm.
And if you have a single country opting out in this way, now, I think given time and circumstance, not all heads of state can make a meeting like this. Also, we understand that South Africa is quite far for some countries. Not all heads of state can make the meeting, but most countries are making the effort to participate. Now, we can't stop the G20 because one head of state decided last week that he no longer is interested in this. And some of the reasons are so completely spurious. He addressed a conference in Florida on Monday past when he said he will not come to South Africa because of our treatment of people. And he says Florida is full of people who escaped the communist regime in South Africa, and this has been going on for decades. Now, any South African would know that that is just bunkum.
Yeah.
What communist regime in South Africa that has been going on for decades? And where are these people who escaped this communist regime? No, I'm sure that these are marks of somebody who isn't altogether there every single day.
Yeah.
But what do I know?
Yeah. And as you say, I mean, this doesn't nullify or in some way takes away the credibility of this important event. You led the South African G20 Africa expert panel. You've handed over that report to President Cyril Ramaphosa. What were at the center of those discussions? What's in the report?
The report is focused largely on the kinds of circumstances that still confront Africa. The big bugbear in Africa is debt. And because of debt, development is constrained. And because of the constraint of development, of course, there's very little growth on the continent. So the issue of debt is so fundamentally important because what we've seen is that countries tend not to default on debt because defaults are unbelievably difficult. And we've had, uh, in the past few years, some countries have had to default. Um, Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, Senegal, amongst others. And that creates a massive problem because it shuts countries out of the ability to borrow for 2 to 3 years. Now, that happens to countries when they are at their most desperate. So we need to look at that issue. But also, in the endeavor to prevent defaulting, what happens is that countries default on their people. So they underfund education and healthcare to ensure that the bankers are always paid. And increasing numbers of people, increasing numbers of countries spend more on debt service costs than they do on healthcare. Many countries do that, and a slightly lesser number more on debt service costs than they do on education. As President Mandela once told me, if you're spending more on debt service than on education, you're spending more on yesterday than on tomorrow. So these are the issues. It's quite central to the way in which we look at the issues of the African continent. So if that's what happens with debt, what contributes to that? Obviously, you then examine the costs of capital. And the drivers of the cost of capital include issues such as the very adverse credit ratings that countries on the continent have. And so one of the issues that we call out is for transparency for the ratings agencies so that countries can know what they do. We've been able to access reports on this matter where there have been comparisons country by country that looks at the major metrics used by the ratings agencies. It would be debt to GDP, GDP growth, and so on. And you can see that developing countries are horribly disadvantaged in this. And if your rating is poor, then your interest rates are higher. So you're always feeding more to the bankers than you are to your people. So the issue for a reset of what happens with the ratings agencies becomes important.
Yeah.
Then also we've raised issues relating to the IMF and the World Bank, where we need to undertake what we're calling for a study of governance and ensure that the norms that were there from 1945 can actually be re-examined. Just an aside, Clement, in 2007, 2008, I led an international team appointed by the then managing director of the IMF to examine governance of the IMF. And we produced a very good report. And when it came to the time to present the report, Lehman Brothers had collapsed. The global economy was in a terrible state, and our report was not entertained. So the report is there somewhere. It makes points about improving on the governance of the IMF, but it's never come up again. And those issues remain relevant both in the IMF and the World Bank. So we've got to endeavor to deal with some of those issues as well. And then we also recognize that in a very distinct way, the lenders, the creditors have clubs where they talk about the situation, where they compare notes and so on. The largest of those is called the Paris Club. And then there's also the Club of London, which is similarly structured. But the borrowers, the debtors, don't actually have any place where they can talk to each other. And so one of the proposals that our report makes is for a debtors club or platform or some place where debtors can convene and compare notes and do peer-to-peer learning. because frequently when countries get into a situation where they borrow, they are desperate. And so whatever the lenders put on the table, they tend to accept. And we'd like to believe that there's sufficient experience around from current ministers, former ministers, ministers who found themselves in distress, who should be able to help countries, prevent that debt trap, but as they get into the situation of having to borrow, trying to equip them to better deal with these issues.
So sort of form
the
like
borrowers,
form like a borrowers club, so to speak, to present a united front.
not a united front, because I think you still face your. It's not quite a stokvel. You still face your lenders individually, but we'd like to believe that countries that are better equipped to engage with these issues come off better. In fact, that idea arose in a number of different places this year. It arose in the Jubilee Report, which was commissioned by the late Pope Francis. It also arose in a report commissioned by the UN Secretary General. It was a panel of experts. I served on that. It was there in a report by former African heads of state led by former President Obasanjo. It was certainly a central feature of the Financing for Development conference that was held in Seville in Spain in June this year. So there is a broad theme. There's broad support. There's also resistance to the idea, but we've got to see it through. And we make a very strong recommendation that the South African Minister of Finance should start this process by inviting his colleagues, African ministers of finance, to a discussion, because it's important that current governments shape what happens to the club or platform.
What do you make of, because the IMF often they would argue that the countries that approach the lending institutions are already in financial crisis mode and terrible at managing their finances, and often they don't have the ability to pay the money back. So to be on the safe side, the IMF then may argue to impose these conditions, as unfair as they may be, so that they can guarantee that the money will be paid back.
The situation of the IMF has varied over time. In fact, during 2020, President Ramaphosa, who was chair of the AU during that period, and it asked a number of us, Dr. Kabaruka, former finance minister in Rwanda, Dr. Ngozi Nkonjo-Iweala, former finance minister in Nigeria, Strive Masiwa from Zimbabwe, Tijan Tiam, an entrepreneur from the Ivory Coast. We'd worked on issues together for Africa, and spoke to a number of agencies. We met with virtually every African head of state, met with a number of finance ministers, met with a number of institutions across the world, and met with the IMF then. And the managing director of the IMF, Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, was very, very forthcoming on a range of issues. And it set a good platform for working, including how we might be able to better use. There's a facility in the IMF called special drawing rights to advance development needs in Africa. And that was one of the features of a kind of reborn IMF. And when this government in the US came in, the Treasury Secretary in January, February this year said to the IMF, you've expanded your mandate too far, get back to your original mandate. So none of that talk. You must just deal with what you must deal with. So it's created a bit of uncertainty in the management of the IMF as well. But these are issues that have
Yeah.
to be attended to.
Yeah, Mr. Manuel, I've got a minute left. On the resetting of ratings agencies, do you think the agencies should reform their current criteria to sort of include precious mineral reserves and other strong commodities held by these emerging economies?
Well, that's a difficult call, Clements. The problem, of course, is if you look at take the DRC that has an amazing reserve of all manner of precious minerals and rare earths. Um, you know, others own the mineral rights. So, how does the country collateralize its debt with rights that actually belong to other people? So, it's a difficult call, an interesting one, but a difficult one because it would vary with time and circumstance. Even in South Africa, notwithstanding the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, which vests mineral rights effectively in the state. The mineral rights are acquired by mining companies, and it's very hard for the state to use that as collateral.
Yeah. Trevor Manuel, thank you so much for making time for us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Clement. Thank you.